The first box is heavier than it looks. Dust lifts in a soft cloud as the lid scrapes back, revealing reels of 16mm film coiled like sleeping snakes, field journals bound with string, and letters typed on onion skin paper so thin you can almost see the hands that folded them. On the top sheet, a faded rubber stamp, declassified. The word doesn't feel like freedom. It feels like an apology that arrived decades late. We are a small documentary team, myself as the narrator and investigator, alongside a cameraman and sound tech, drawn to this forgotten government archive by whispers of unsealed Cold War files. Amy Cohen, the archivist with a sharp eye for hidden patterns, works the room like someone who knows which shelves have a second life behind them. She's a cartographer by temperament, mapping what others tried to scatter. These boxes don't have owners, she says, tilting one toward the light. Inside, a list of inventory numbers stops mid-sentence, as if a hand was pulled away just before the line that mattered. She lays our path out with quiet certainty. Chronology is broken, but not lost. We thread a projector and watch a sun-bleached parade of images shudder to life. Men in fatigue standing with their backs to a flash. Rows of metal cots in a room that looks like a school dormitory. A close-up of a clipboard where risk, acceptable, is circled in pencil. The film is silent, but the journals aren't. Notes in tidy script tally symptoms, exposures, and subject compliance. In the margins, coffee rings, fingerprints, and a single smeared initial. The bureaucracy speaks its own language, precise, bloodless, practiced. A letter surfaces from beneath the reels, signed in a name we will come to recognize. Dr. Elias Grant, a shadowy figure whose signature appears across decades of these files. It thanks a university department for expedient cooperation and requests discretion due to sensitivity at higher echelons. Another letter, from a different box, praises a prison warden for facilitating participation. The phrases are interchangeable, the tone unwavering. You can almost hear the meetings where the words were chosen. Careful enough to conceal, confident enough to proceed. We lay 3 documents side by side. A budget memo, a lab protocol, a travel voucher stamped for a town that doesn't appear on most maps. The dates cross-stitch the early 1950s to the late 1960s, but the pattern is older. Find the quietest corners of the country and do the loudest things there. Amy traces the lines with a gloved finger. It's a system, she says, not as a revelation but as a verdict. The camera lingers on her face as if to measure the cost of saying it out loud. Some files pretend to be ordinary. Maintenance logs, supply orders, shipping crates labeled educational materials. Their ordinariness is the disguise. Tucked between toner receipts and custodial schedules, we find a requisition for dosimeters, a bulk purchase of iodine, and an envelope that once carried film canisters from a desert base to a city lab. When the archive wants to hide, it doesn't bury the truth. It drowns it in the everyday. A manila folder cracks like dry bark as we open it. Inside, Polaroids of children in uniform rows at breakfast. The caption reads, Nutrition Cohort B. There is no laughter in these pictures, only compliance. Another photo, a close-up of forearms, skin patch-tested in a grid. The back of the photograph is stamped with a grant number. We don't yet know what it funds, but we can guess whom it does not protect. The room seems to shrink as the faces on the table multiply. And then the flicker of a personal voice. A letter never sent, folded around itself a dozen times, written in a wobbly hand. I did what they told me. I thought it was for good. No signature, only a date and a place, both familiar from our ledgers. The writer describes a boy who asked why his oatmeal tasted metallic, a soldier who asked if the tremor would pass, a prisoner who asked how much longer. Questions with answers that were chosen for them. We look up from the page, as if the author might walk in asking for it back. By late afternoon, our table is a topographic map of grief. Peaks of paper, valleys of film, a river of staples and paperclips flowing through it all. We can now see an outline not just of acts but of intent. The evidence is not one smoking gun. It is a choir of small, cold decisions that harmonize into something unmistakable. If knowledge was the stated destination, The route was paved with people who could not say no. The air in the archive changes when an idea becomes a pattern. As we pack the first day's findings into labeled trays, a question tightens its grip. What force makes ordinary offices into front lines? The dates on our documents point to a moment when science met strategy and shook hands in a closed room. Tomorrow, we will follow that handshake into the corridors where national security turned from phrase to policy, and where haste and secrecy set the terms of what would be done, and to whom. The documents from the archive point us toward a moment of profound transformation, linking directly to the post-World War II era when the U.S. recruited former Nazi scientists under Operation Paperclip, importing not just expertise but a mindset that viewed human experimentation as a tool of power. In the years after the war, the laboratory became a battlefield of its own, shaped not by tanks and rifles but by policies and grants. The Cold War was young, paranoia was thick, and the idea of national security had grown elastic enough to cover anything from nuclear weapons to school cafeterias. Science was no longer just about discovery, it was about survival. And in that survival race, ethics became expendable ballast. Declassified memos reveal how swiftly universities and government agencies aligned. One letter from a senior defense official urges a dean of medicine to expedite cooperative ventures, noting that delays might compromise strategic advantage. Another, stamped confidential, outlines the creation of new funding streams, money not earmarked for public knowledge, but for results that could be tucked into classified files. The promise of resources was irresistible, and the bargain was simple. Don't ask questions you don't want answers to. Our camera pans across a map layered with pins. Each pin marks an institution awarded a grant, each line a corridor of secrecy connecting it to military command. Now overlay a second map, one of orphanages, reform schools, and prisons. The alignment is chilling. Remote enough to avoid scrutiny, contained enough to control, these places offered what laboratories needed most: bodies that could not refuse. The phrase easily managed populations appears in one briefing, written in the margins like a quiet directive. The pressure was immense. Reports show that young scientists were told their careers hinged on their willingness to contribute to the national effort. Those who hesitated found their grants evaporating. Those who complied found doors opening to cutting-edge equipment, prestigious conferences, and promises of influence. The line between patriotism and ambition blurred until it was no longer visible. How many breakthroughs, the files silently ask, were built on silence itself? In one undisclosed note, a junior researcher confessed in a diary entry, "I know this is wrong, but if I speak, my family starves." Such internal conflicts were buried deep, revealing the human toll even among the perpetrators. On screen, a veteran historian describes it as science under crosshairs. He explains that the push for speed, answers in months, not years, meant corners weren't just cut, they were erased. Safety protocols became interference. Consent became a logistical barrier. The justification was constant. If we don't do it, someone else will. And in a world shadowed by the mushroom cloud, that rationale carried the weight of inevitability. But behind the rhetoric, a darker truth emerges. Minutes from one strategy meeting reveal a chilling calculus. Civilian backlash must be avoided. Trials should remain internal. In plain terms, that meant people without a voice would bear the risks: orphans, prisoners, soldiers under command. The state wasn't just protecting itself. It was designating who could be sacrificed in its name. Knowledge and morality were no longer partners, they were adversaries. Amy Cohen spreads a series of grants across the table like playing cards. The amounts vary, but the language is consistent: pilot study, controlled environment, expedited findings. In the margins of one, a handwritten note asks whether community inquiries should be anticipated. The answer is underlined, unlikely. It is in these quiet dismissals that the story begins to shift from bureaucratic oversight to systemic intent. As we trace the lines of money and influence, a pattern emerges. The institutions that received the most support were those closest to vulnerable populations. It wasn't coincidence. It was design. Science, under the banner of security, had been given a blank check, and the people least able to resist would pay the balance. The map grows crowded with names and numbers, but one cluster draws our attention. a children's facility in New England, marked with both a research contract and a shipping log for dietary supplements. The trail from policy to practice has now become visible. The archive boxes are no longer abstract, they are doorways. Our next step is into the dormitories of those who never consented, where warm meals and promises of education concealed something far colder. And it is there, among the youngest and most powerless, that this story takes its first devastatingly human turn. The school stands in black and white photographs like any other mid-century institution. Brick walls, long dormitories, children in identical uniforms lined up for breakfast. But the documents on our table give those ordinary images a different weight. They reveal a program marketed to administrators as Enrichment in Nutrition Studies, funded quietly by a university department with military ties. The children were told they were helping science, while receiving warm oatmeal and milk. What they weren't told was that their food carried radioactive isotopes like iodine-131 and strontium-90, designed to trace how the body absorbed radiation under stress. Experiments inspired by fears of nuclear fallout but tested on the innocent. One file includes a curriculum brochure promising students the chance to be junior researchers. The phrase "innocent on paper" masks something far more troubling. Experiments conducted on minors who could not give consent, in institutions where questions were discouraged. A ledger shows shipments labeled "fortified supplements" arriving at the orphanage. In margins scrawled in pencil, "concentration adjusted, observe latency." The children weren't being educated. They were being monitored for thyroid damage and bone marrow changes that would manifest years later as cancers and growth stunts. Then, from the archive, a voice, shaky but unflinching. Adeline, now in her 70s, recalls the taste of that oatmeal. It was metallic sometimes. We used to joke that it was the spoons. She pauses, hands folded tight, and then adds, "They never told us it was part of an experiment. Not once. We thought we were just lucky to get food." Her testimony, simple and devastating, transforms sterile charts into something visceral. A face, a memory, a lifetime marked by leukemia that struck in her 40s, leaving her with chronic fatigue and a distrust of doctors. The files describe how the children were divided into cohorts, some given placebos, others dosed without their knowledge. Results were logged clinically. Subject 14, mild nausea, resumed activity. Subject 21, growth chart anomaly. There is no mention of how the subjects felt, only how they performed. Every child reduced to data, their individual lives collapsed into numbers. And yet, in Adeline's memory, we glimpse the human cost. Children who cried at night from stomach cramps, others who seemed perpetually tired but were told they were simply lazy. Decades later, many developed thyroid cancer or infertility, their lives shortened by an average of 15 years, according to follow-up studies buried in the files. What makes these revelations more chilling is the institutional language that cloaked them. The reports consistently framed the trials as non-invasive, a term that ignored the long-term health effects. One memo reassures funders that potential objections are mitigated by the lack of parental oversight. In other words, orphans were selected not because they offered the best scientific sample, but because no one would object on their behalf. Vulnerability itself had become the experiment's foundation. A haunting still photograph is projected on screen. Rows of children seated at breakfast tables, heads bowed over their bowls. The caption, typed neatly at the bottom, reads, "Nutrition Cohort B." To the untrained eye, it's just a school meal. But knowing what we now know, it's evidence of a silent betrayal. What looked like care was, in truth, exploitation. The audience feels the shift, innocence corrupted by secrecy. As Amy Cohen flips through another set of letters, we see how the program was justified to higher authorities. Early interventions in childhood, one line reads, will yield long-term insights into population resilience. The children were not being raised. They were being treated as prototypes for an unknown future. Every test meal, every dosage was part of a ledger that had no space for dignity. And the outcomes? Files reveal elevated cancer rates in survivors, but no apologies, just quiet settlements in the 1990s that barely covered medical bills. And yet, Perhaps the most damning revelation isn't in the numbers, but in the way these trials were normalized. Teachers and caretakers were reassured that they were fostering progress. The phrase repeated like a mantra, shielding those involved from confronting the truth. Progress for whom? Progress at what cost? Those questions were never asked inside those walls, though one caretaker's anonymous note confesses, "The kid's eyes haunt me. I knew it was wrong." As the camera lingers on Adeline's face, her eyes shining with a mix of anger and resignation, the story pivots. What began in the silence of an orphanage grows louder, spreading outward. Because if children without guardians could be turned into test subjects, then who else stood at risk? The answer, the files suggest, lay just beyond the orphanage gates, in the locked cells of America's prisons. The prison blocks of the Northeast looked like any others. Rows of iron bars, echoing corridors, the clang of boots on concrete. But within those walls, something unusual unfolded. A wing of the facility had been transformed into what reports blandly called a research unit. In reality, it was a laboratory without oversight, where human skin, blood, and endurance became commodities. For a handful of dollars, a shortened sentence, or simply the hope of leniency, inmates were persuaded or pressured to sign forms they barely understood. Substances like dioxin, the active ingredient in Agent Orange, and plutonium were injected or applied, testing tolerance for chemical warfare agents. The paperwork used inside these walls carried the veneer of legitimacy. Voluntary participation, the forms declared, followed by dense medical jargon that most prisoners couldn't parse. For men who often struggled even with basic literacy, those terms were meaningless. Former inmate Lewis Davis remembers the day he signed. They said it was just lotion, something harmless. Next thing I knew, my arm was blistered, and they were taking pictures. His voice is steady, but the silence that follows carries the weight of betrayal. Years later, those blisters turned into skin cancers, and Lewis battled chronic pain that ended his ability to work. The experiments ranged from topical creams and injections to deliberate burns and chemical exposures. Some inmates were dosed with substances described only by code numbers, including hallucinogens like LSD in early MKUltra tests. Photographs from the files show bare chests marked with grids, each square treated differently, as though the men were living test boards. "We joked about it," Lewis recalls, "because what else could we do? But it wasn't a joke when the pain didn't go away." The laughter of survival echoes against the cold, clinical notes of the researchers, who noted tumors forming but rarely intervened. In the official reports, every entry is methodical. Subject tolerated exposure with minimal complaint. Healing within expected parameters. Nowhere do the reports mention the long nights when pain made sleep impossible, or the lingering scars that followed men long after their release. On paper, the suffering was neat, quantified, and easily filed away. For the men themselves, it was anything but. Many died prematurely from organ failure or suicide, their families left with unanswered questions. What strikes us most is the parallel. Just as orphans were chosen for their lack of guardians, prisoners were targeted because their voices could be contained. One internal memo even phrases it plainly. Institutional populations provide reliable continuity. It was convenience disguised as science, efficiency purchased at the cost of human dignity. Vulnerability, once again, became the ticket to exploitation. And the perpetrators? Dr. Grant, whose name appears here too, retired comfortably without facing charges, his role downplayed in later investigations. Amy Cohen places side by side two forms, one from the orphanage, one from the prison. Different fonts, different institutions, but the same phrasing, risk acceptable, subject compliant. The language doesn't just mirror itself, it repeats like a template. A pattern is emerging, unmistakable now. The less power a person had, the more likely they were to be chosen. The testimonies break through the sterile bureaucracy. Lewis admits that, at the time, he didn't think of himself as a victim. "We thought it was just part of the deal, part of being locked up. They told us we were helping people, so maybe it made us feel useful. But now, I wonder if we were just disposable to them." His reflection echoes Adeline's from the orphanage. Voices separated by miles and decades, yet united by the same invisible hand. Lewis's life after prison was marked by PTSD and health issues, leading to homelessness before he found advocacy groups. The corridor of the prison fades into the shadowed stacks of the archive, where Amy uncovers another set of forms, this time labeled informed consent templates. These were the blueprints of justification, the illusion of choice that turned exploitation into policy. To understand how the system functioned so smoothly, we must now look closely at those papers themselves. Because hidden in their fine print is the machinery that allowed an entire generation of human experiments to masquerade as voluntary science. The forms look harmless at first, 1 page, 2 signatures, a few boxes ticked. But the deeper we go, the clearer it becomes. These informed consent documents were less about informing and more about protecting institutions. Amy spreads 3 versions across the table, dated years apart, yet their structure barely changes. Each begins with the same promise. Participation is voluntary. Then, in dense paragraphs of medical language, the risks dissolve into abstraction. Phrases like mild discomfort, standing in place of burns, nausea, or radiation exposure. Buried clauses waived rights to sue, ensuring survivors like Adeline and Lewis had no legal recourse decades later. We bring in a legal historian to decode the jargon. She points to phrases like, within acceptable tolerance and anticipated side effects, explaining how they were designed to shift accountability. The subject, by signing, she notes, assumed responsibility for what they couldn't possibly understand. For an orphan who couldn't read or a prisoner unfamiliar with medical terminology, that signature was less consent than surrender. The forms did not empower participants. They insulated the researchers, many of whom faced no penalties and continued careers in academia. Letters tucked alongside the templates confirm this intent. One administrator reassures a project coordinator, our counsel advises the form is sufficient to deflect liability. Another adds, language need not be simplified, as populations involved are unlikely to litigate. The coldness is striking. Not only were the participants uninformed, but their very inability to object was part of the calculus. Silence was not an accident. It was engineered. In one undisclosed draft, a lawyer suggested adding psychological effects possible, but it was struck out to avoid unnecessary alarm. The illusion of choice runs deeper when we compare these forms to personal accounts. Adeline recalls being told she was joining a nutrition program. Lewis remembers hearing that his blistered arm was part of routine dermatology research. Neither of them heard the words chemical exposure, long-term risk, or possible organ damage. Yet their signatures were used to frame their involvement as voluntary. On screen, the gap between what they were told and what was recorded is a chasm, one that allowed experiments to continue unchecked until the 1970s scandals. Amy points to a repeated annotation stamped across the forms, risk acceptable. The phrase appears again and again, copied into margins, underlined in reports, echoed in memos. Acceptable to whom? Certainly not to the children who cried in their dormitories or the prisoners whose scars never healed. The phrase doesn't measure risk, it normalizes it. Risk, in these documents, becomes not something to be avoided but something to be managed, distributed onto those least able to resist. Modern echoes appear in bioethics debates, where similar language justifies vaccine trials in developing countries. What emerges is not a series of isolated lapses but a system polished over years. The templates provided cover for scientists, assurance for funders, and plausible deniability for officials. One might even call them the skeleton key of exploitation, documents that open doors to experiments that should never have been attempted. In their dry, legalistic tone lies the real violence, the erasure of humanity through paperwork. And yet, the paper trail has its flaws. Notes scribbled in margins, reword if challenged, risk underestimated, betray the unease of those who drafted them. The cracks are visible, if only faintly, in the language itself. These slips remind us that not everyone was comfortable, though few had the courage to resist outright. One drafter, in a confidential email equivalent from the era, admitted, "This feels like Nuremberg all over again. The machinery of secrecy relied on complicity, and complicity was easier when dressed in legal phrasing. As we close the folder, the silence lingers. Consent, the bedrock of ethical science, had been hollowed out into theater. Behind the signatures, the experiments pressed on, their justification secured by forms designed never to be questioned. But the archive is about to lead us somewhere no paperwork can disguise. A desert where soldiers march toward a rising fireball, their consent presumed, their survival uncertain. The grainy black and white film hums to life on the projector. Rows of young men in fatigues march across a barren Nevada desert, their rifles slung at their sides, their helmets tilted against the wind. Suddenly, the horizon erupts, an incandescent flash that swallows the frame. The camera shakes, then steadies, capturing silhouettes of soldiers crouched in trenches, ordered to turn their backs to the blast. We were told to face away, cover our eyes, and wait for the shockwave, recalls James Harper, a veteran now in his 80s. His voice is steady, but the images betray the scale of what words can't contain. This was Operation Plumbob, one of over 200 atmospheric nuclear tests, where troops were exposed to doses far exceeding safety limits. The exercise was called a troop maneuver, a test of battlefield readiness under nuclear conditions. In reality, it was exposure, calculated, deliberate, and meticulously recorded. Field journals pulled from our archive detail the drills. Men instructed to rise minutes after detonation and march toward the mushroom cloud. Dosimeter readings were logged with precision. Symptoms, nausea, headaches, burns were noted in shorthand. What is absent from every page is the most important question. Why were they sent there at all? The undisclosed goal: to study acute radiation syndrome for potential atomic warfare, with soldiers as live guinea pigs. One reel shows soldiers walking calmly through a haze of dust, their shadows stretching long across the desert floor. To officials, this was data. How troops function in a contaminated environment, how morale held under extraordinary stress. To the men, it was something else entirely. Harper describes wiping grit from his lips that tasted like metal shavings. He remembers his comrades coughing, squinting at their hands, some joking nervously that they'd glow in the dark. The laughter, he admits, never reached their eyes. Many later developed leukemias and cataracts, with Harper himself undergoing multiple surgeries for thyroid cancer. The official line was that these maneuvers prepared soldiers for the future battlefield. Yet the reports we find carry another subtext, an unspoken experiment in human endurance against radiation. One memo lists exposure limits acceptable for operational use. Another, striking in its candor, notes casualties predicted minimal. Casualties. The word reduces young men, barely out of adolescence, into statistical projections, their individuality erased in the glow of the blast. Follow-up data, hidden until 1993, showed a 30% higher cancer rate among participants. Amy Cohen overlays the Nevada blast sites onto our growing map of connections. The same agencies funding the orphanage nutrition programs and the prison dermatology studies appear again in the desert paperwork. The surnames of reviewers recur, like echoes across decades and institutions. It's no longer coincidence, it's infrastructure, a web of funding and oversight that moved seamlessly from classrooms to cells, from clinics to craters. Dr. Grant's name appears here too, approving dosimetry protocols before quietly vanishing into retirement. But the desert had another audience, those who lived just beyond the fence lines. Letters in the archive, written by mothers in small Nevada towns, speak of children falling ill, livestock dying, and dust that never seemed to wash away. Their words resonate with the veterans' testimonies. Different lives, the same invisible enemy. The fallout didn't respect boundaries. Neither did the secrecy. These downwinders suffered thyroid cancers at rates 10 times the national average. Their plight ignored until class action lawsuits in the 1980s forced partial admissions. The soldiers themselves rarely spoke of what they endured. Harper recalls being told not to discuss the maneuvers, even with family. It was about discipline, he explains, about loyalty. We didn't question. We just did it. His pause stretches long before he adds, "But the questions never stopped inside me." The silence, imposed from above, became its own weapon, an experiment not just in radiation, but in obedience. Harper's post-service life was plagued by nightmares and health bills, his pension barely covering treatments. The desert reels end with frames of men returning to camp, their uniforms dust-stained, their faces unreadable. The footage fades, but the questions it raises only sharpen. If even soldiers sworn to duty could be exposed without explanation, what of the towns scattered downwind? In the next files, those small communities, farmers, teachers, children, step into the story, unwitting inheritors of the radioactive clouds that drifted silently across their skies. The wind maps are haunting in their simplicity. Arrows sweep eastward from Nevada test sites, carrying invisible clouds across farmland, schoolyards, and quiet towns. What officials once called harmless dust turns out, in the files before us, to be laced with radioactive isotopes like cesium-137 and plutonium-239. On the page, it looks clinical: exposure estimates, rainfall patterns, dispersal charts. But in the letters stacked beside them, the same winds have names, faces, and funerals attached. Entire families wiped out by rare cancers, with birth defects spiking in newborns. A mother from Utah writes in shaky penmanship about her son's sudden sickness. "He used to run with the other boys. Now he can't get out of bed." Another letter, from a teacher in Arizona, describes rows of empty desks after what she calls a season of coughing. These words were never meant for public eyes. They were appeals, written to agencies that rarely replied. And when they did, the answers were rehearsed. No cause for concern. Symptoms unrelated to testing. Yet internal memos admitted the link, with one noting, "Downwind exposure exceeds projections. Monitor quietly." Photographs emerge from one envelope. Children playing beneath swing sets, their shadows stretching long under a cloudless sky. The captions, handwritten by parents, become unbearable when paired with the maps. Each playground lies directly beneath the fallout path from a test conducted days earlier. The juxtaposition is stark. Bureaucrats logged isotopes by the microcurie, while families logged gravestones by the year. One family lost 3 children to leukemia within 5 years, their story mirroring hundreds in declassified health surveys. Amy Cohen aligns the mother's letters with government graphs, pinning them to a single timeline. The overlap is undeniable. Where the charts show spikes in contamination, the letters speak of waves of illness. What official reports frame as downwind effects were, to these families, the collapse of ordinary life. The sterile phrase low-yield exposure belies the suffering of entire communities that never chose to be part of the experiment. Compensation came in 1990 via the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, but only after decades of denial, leaving many claims rejected. In one file marked Public Communications, a memo suggests a strategy: emphasize patriotism, downplay risk. Another recommends encouraging residents to see themselves as participants in national defense. The language reframes victims as volunteers, stripping away their right to protest. To question was to appear disloyal, and loyalty in the Cold War climate was a weapon as powerful as the bomb itself. Whistleblowers who spoke out were labeled communists, their careers ruined. The oral histories fill in what the memos omit. Survivors, now in their 70s and 80s, speak of clusters of leukemia, miscarriages, and livestock born deformed. They recall the grit that coated their windowsills, the dust storms that rolled in after detonations. "We didn't know what it was," one man says softly. "We just knew it wasn't right." Their stories ripple outward, widening the circle of the harmed beyond soldiers and inmates to entire towns that never gave permission. Modern DNA studies link their descendants' health issues to the fallout, a generational curse. The desert, it seems, was not a contained test site but the center of a widening radius of harm. The fallout drifted across state lines, across generations, its legacy etched into both medical charts and family trees. And yet, while communities begged for answers, the funding streams that fueled these experiments only grew stronger. As Amy pulls another box from the archive, the pattern becomes sharper. Inside are budget ledgers, stamped contracts, and signatures, evidence not just of what happened but of how it was sustained. To understand the machinery that kept these programs alive, we must now follow the money, the grants and contracts that bound universities, laboratories, and government agencies into a single web of silence. The papers in this next box don't show photographs of sick children or blistered skin. They show ledgers, columns of numbers, project codes, and transfer receipts. At first glance, they look dull, administrative, harmless. But as Amy Cohen begins to trace them, the picture sharpens into something far more disturbing. A network of money and authority that underwrote everything we've seen so far. The cruelty of the experiments was not improvised, it was financed, with billions funneled through the Atomic Energy Commission and CIA slush funds. We pin documents to a wall in the archive until they form what looks like a conspiracy board. University departments at Harvard, MIT, Penn State, private contractors with innocuous names, federal agencies with deep coffers. Red string isn't necessary, the codes themselves overlap. A grant number tied to a nutritional enrichment study in a New England orphanage also appears in a budget line for dermatological trials inside a Pennsylvania prison. And just beneath those, the same digits surface in a requisition order for radiation equipment used in the Nevada desert. Total funding? Over $500 million adjusted for inflation, much of it black budget. Amy points out a memo buried among the financial records. Coordinator approval required for 3 streams. The streams are never named, but the initials of the approving official match those found on both the orphanage files and the troop maneuver reports. One man, one office, linking programs across populations who would never meet but shared the same fate. The money, the oversight, the justification all flowed through the same channels. This coordinator, later identified as a high-level Pentagon official, died in 1985 without facing inquiry. We interview a former research assistant, now in his 80s, who remembers filling out travel vouchers for his department. We knew the projects were classified, but the funding was good. Too good. New labs, new equipment, trips to conferences overseas. You didn't ask questions about where it came from. You just felt lucky to have it. His words expose how easily morality was drowned out by opportunity. To many, secrecy wasn't suspicious. It was just the price of progress. He himself quit after witnessing a prisoner's reaction, haunted by guilt that led to alcoholism. The documents show how carefully this system protected itself. Contracts were written through third-party foundations, insulating universities from direct blame. Reports were fragmented, one piece sent to a contractor, another to a military office, so no single file revealed the whole picture. When public inquiries loomed, phrases like pilot study or feasibility project blurred the edges. To an outsider, it all looked like routine bureaucracy. Only when the pieces are assembled does the shape of the machine emerge, echoing scandals like the Tuskegee syphilis study where similar tactics hid abuses. And what a machine it was. Money flowed down, data flowed up, and in between stood the orphans, the prisoners, the soldiers, the farmers. Vulnerable lives transformed into expendable variables. The bureaucratic language cloaked it as convergence of interests. In truth, it was a conveyor belt. People fed in at one end, research results at the other. Amy's voice grows tight as she says, "It's not a series of mistakes. It's a system, a deliberate system. The data harvested, used in everything from radiation therapy advancements to chemical weapons, but at what human cost?" On camera, we lay the contracts side by side. The same signatures authorizing both a children's feeding trial and a desert detonation study. The evidence is undeniable. The programs were not isolated experiments but nodes in a single, interconnected web. A web sustained by money, by secrecy, and by a shared belief that certain lives could be risked for the sake of knowledge wrapped in the flag of national security. But every system, no matter how carefully built, eventually cracks. The next set of boxes reveals the fault lines. Anonymous letters, uneasy committee notes, and congressional hearings where the truth first slipped into daylight. The silence that had protected the machine was beginning to fracture, and the voices of doubt, once whispers, were about to grow loud enough to be heard on the Senate floor. The silence began to splinter in the 1970s, triggered by the Church Committee investigations into CIA abuses, which uncovered MKUltra and related programs. A new generation of journalists, activists, and congressional staffers stumbled upon fragments of the truth. Stray memos, leaked reports, half-burned copies pulled from trash bins. What had once been locked away in the language of grants and classified stamps began leaking through hairline cracks. The machine we mapped in ledgers was not collapsing, but its seams were showing. And in those seams, voices began to slip through. The first tremors arrived in the form of anonymous letters. One, typed on an old manual machine, simply read, "We did what we were told, but someone should know." Attached was a page of dosage charts, stripped of names but thick with numbers. Another letter, handwritten, confessed unease at procedures involving minors, and pleaded for confidentiality. The authors remained hidden, their fear evident in every line. Yet their words proved that inside the system, conscience had not been completely extinguished. One letter's author was later revealed as a nurse who committed suicide after being threatened. Then came the committees. In Washington, Senate hearings convened to investigate ethical safeguards in research. On television, senators asked carefully staged questions while bureaucrats offered carefully rehearsed answers. Footage shows rows of officials seated behind microphones, black binders in front of them, their words measured to the syllable. Any risks were within acceptable limits. But behind those binders lay the files we now hold, and their dry, clipped testimony cannot mask the human toll. No prosecutions followed. Officials retired with pensions, their names scrubbed from public records. The archive reveals just how hard those officials worked to control the narrative. Pages are redacted into near silence, whole paragraphs obliterated by thick black bars. But what remains visible tells its own story. Contract sums, test site codes, references to institutional populations. Even without names, the pattern shines through. It is as though the censors, in their effort to conceal, inadvertently underline the truth. One redacted file still shows a budget for mind alteration agents, linking to later sections. Amy Cohen lays a redacted page beneath a letter from a survivor. On one, inked-out lines insist the details must never surface. On the other, a trembling hand describes night sweats, memory lapses, and fear that it might all be connected. The juxtaposition is jarring. Bureaucracy blotting out identities, survivors writing them back in. It's not just a paper battle. It's a struggle for memory itself. Survivors like Adeline testified in closed sessions, their words dismissed as unreliable. Public hearings produced headlines, but rarely justice. Reports were filed, recommendations made, oversight committees formed. Yet the machinery kept turning. They gave us procedure instead of truth, recalls one journalist who covered the hearings. It looked like progress, but it was really containment. In the archives, this rings true. Reforms written into law were often too late or too narrow to reach those already harmed. Funding for similar programs shifted to black ops, continuing under new guises. And still, the leaks did damage. A culture of secrecy that had seemed impenetrable began to wobble under scrutiny. Each whistleblower, each anonymous letter, was a crack in the facade. Together, they formed a chorus of unease that no black bar could completely erase. What had been whispered in laboratories and prison wards now echoed in newsprint and committee transcripts, paving the way for revelations about mind control. The question now loomed larger than ever. If secrecy could hide experiments on children, prisoners, and soldiers, what else had it concealed? The answer lay in the next set of files, projects that stepped past the body and into the mind, where control itself became the experiment. What happens when science decides even human thought can be a battlefield? The next box in the archive feels different. No photos of scorched earth or blistered arms, just dense folders stamped with phrases like behavioral modification and psychochemical field trials. The experiments weren't about the body anymore. They were about the mind. In the climate of the Cold War, paranoia reached into every corner, and intelligence agencies began asking a chilling question. Could human thought itself be engineered, manipulated, or erased? This was Project MKUltra, with over 150 subprojects testing LSD, hypnosis, and sensory deprivation on unwitting subjects. One file details covert hospital programs in which psychiatric patients were given high doses of experimental drugs like LSD and mescaline, sometimes without even being told they were part of a study. Notes read clinically: subject disoriented, subject compliant after second administration. Nowhere does the file acknowledge what compliance meant to the individual, whether it was sedation, confusion, or the quiet loss of one's sense of self. Vulnerability once again became the raw material. Many patients suffered permanent psychosis, with suicides spiking among participants. Another envelope reveals projects that left the hospitals and entered ordinary streets. Apartments in major cities were rented under false names, outfitted with hidden microphones and two-way mirrors. Unwitting visitors were dosed with chemicals in their drinks, observed as they unraveled in real time. The reports described their panic with chilling detachment. Subject attempted escape. Subject calmed with suggestion. For the researchers, it was data. For the subjects, it was violation. Some never recovered, developing schizophrenia or addiction. One famous case involved a CIA employee who jumped from a hotel window after being secretly dosed. The names on these reports are not new to us. Cross-referencing earlier files, Amy Cohen finds that several of the same researchers who once oversaw nutrition trials in orphanages and skin tests in prisons had now pivoted into this new frontier of mind control. It is as if the populations changed, but the logic remained constant. Where power is unequal, experimentation follows. The same bureaucratic cadence, risk acceptable, subject manageable, runs like a thread through decades of programs. Dr. Grant consulted here too, his notes on enhanced interrogation influencing later torture methods. Survivors' testimonies cut through the silence. One man, institutionalized for depression in the 1960s, recalls waking up strapped to a bed, his memory blank after what he later learned were drug injections and repeated electroshock sessions. "I thought I was losing my mind," he says, voice trembling. Turns out someone else was taking it apart. Another woman, a former patient, describes being told she was receiving advanced therapy. The truth: she was a data point in a classified project, left with dissociative identity disorder that shattered her family life. The files reveal how these programs bled into intelligence operations abroad, feeding the fantasy of a weaponized psyche. Reports discuss conditioning and suggestibility as if they were levers to be pulled at will. The human mind was reduced to circuitry, its limits tested under the guise of security. The bureaucratic language almost masks the horror. What reads as subject retained minimal recall translates into someone's life being stripped of its memories. Data from these tests informed Vietnam-era interrogations and even modern no-touch torture techniques. And still, the justification remained the same. A memo from the period captures it bluntly. If adversaries succeed first, consequences catastrophic. Delay unacceptable. Fear of falling behind in the Cold War arms race gave cover to experiments that shredded the boundary between science and abuse. Once again, national security was invoked as both shield and sword. When MKUltra was exposed in 1975, director Sidney Gottlieb shredded documents and fled accountability, dying in 1999 without trial. By the time oversight committees began to ask questions, the damage was already embedded in countless lives. Records were shredded, projects renamed, responsibility dissolved into acronyms. But the survivors' voices, faint though they were, drew the line that documents refused to. This wasn't science gone astray. It was a deliberate system where human beings became instruments. And so, the puzzle grows more intricate. Orphans, prisoners, soldiers, patients, the categories blur into a single continuum of exploitation. The files no longer describe isolated studies, but a chain of practices united by one chilling philosophy: that the powerless could be bent to purpose. As we step out of the archive and into a small hall where survivors begin to meet face to face, the story shifts from documents to people. 3 lives, Adeline, Louis, and James, are about to collide, revealing the human cost that no report could ever fully contain. The room is modest, a community center borrowed for the day. Folding chairs are arranged in a circle, the air heavy with the anticipation of strangers about to share pieces of the same wound. Adeline enters first, clutching a thin folder of documents she's carried for years without knowing what to do with them. Louis follows, slower, his prison tattoos faded but still visible, his step uncertain. Then James Harper, shoulders still straight despite his age, a veteran's bearing intact. Three people who should never have crossed paths, drawn together by a history they never chose, and by our team's invitation to connect the dots. The conversation begins quietly. Adeline speaks of metallic oatmeal and sleepless nights as a child, her words halting until she sees recognition in Louis's eyes. He leans forward, describing blistered skin and doctors who wouldn't explain, only photograph. James listens, nodding slowly, before adding his own story of standing in a trench as the sky turned white. Different decades, different settings, yet the rhythm of their testimonies is eerily alike. Orders given, risks hidden, suffering dismissed. As they talk, they reveal shared aftermaths. Adeline's cancer treatments, Louis's chronic pain, James's infertility, all traced to the experiments. On the table between them, we place copies of the records. Adeline's growth charts, Louis's voluntary consent form, James's dosimeter logs. Side by side, they stop being individual cases and start to look like parts of one system. The group falls silent, the realization heavy. They picked us, Louis finally says, because they knew we couldn't say no. The words hang in the room like a verdict. For the first time, they discuss forgiveness or the lack of it. Adeline admitting she wrote letters to Dr. Grant that went unanswered. A legal scholar, Carla Mendez, joins the circle to explain why their stories have rarely seen justice. She outlines how statutes of limitations expired before many survivors even understood what had been done to them, how classified programs shielded officials from lawsuits, how institutions hid behind technicalities. The system wasn't just built to experiment, she says. It was built to outlast accountability. The survivors nod, not in surprise, but in weary recognition. Mendez reveals that only a fraction of claims succeeded, with total payouts under $2 billion, pennies compared to the harm. James shifts in his chair, recalling how loyalty had once kept him silent. We were soldiers. We followed orders. But loyalty isn't the same as consent. His distinction cuts deep, echoing Adeline's memory of teachers telling her participation was a privilege, and Louis's recollection of prison officials assuring him it was voluntary work. The word choice threads through their stories, but always as illusion, never reality. They share dreams of alternate lives. Adeline as a mother without health fears, Louis as a free man without scars. The room grows heavier as they begin to reckon with the scale. Their personal stories, once private burdens, are now revealed as fragments of a much larger pattern. For the first time, they see their pain not as isolated accidents but as deliberate parts of a broader design. Each of them carries the weight of generations of silence, proof that the same machine operated across time, across institutions, across lives. They exchange contact information, vowing to advocate together, turning victimhood into activism. And yet, amid the grief, a spark of resolve emerges. Adeline admits she once feared her memories weren't real. Now I know they were, she says, voice steady. Louis adds, if they connected us, maybe it's time we connect back. James, ever the soldier, sums it up in one sentence. We can't let them write this off as mistakes. Their unity, fragile but undeniable, becomes a counterpoint to decades of manufactured silence, inspiring modern movements like those for vaccine trial ethics. But as the survivors' voices converge, so too does the story widen. To understand how such abuses could happen under the shadow of international law, we must step back into the history of ethics itself. The world had written codes after Nuremberg, drafted principles meant to protect the vulnerable. And yet, the very nation that championed those codes found ways to sidestep them. In the next chapter, we return to those promises on paper, and the moral chasm between what was declared and what was done. The story shifts now from the survivors circle back into the archives, where stacks of legal documents and dusty textbooks remind us that rules did exist. After World War II, the Nuremberg Code was written with absolute clarity. No human subject should ever be experimented on without voluntary, informed consent. It was supposed to be a line in the sand, drawn with the blood of the past. And yet, the files we've uncovered show how easily that line was blurred, circumvented, or ignored when national interest was invoked. U.S. officials prosecuted Nazis while running parallel programs at home. In one government report, an administrator references the code almost dismissively, noting, "Principles cited where applicable, though interpretation remains flexible." Flexible. The word turns the hard edge of ethics into something malleable, bendable to suit research agendas. Another document highlights a chilling contrast. While American prosecutors condemned Nazi doctors for coercion, U.S. officials back home were drafting memos justifying tests on prisoners as opportunities for rehabilitation. The irony is sharp, the hypocrisy undeniable. Some paperclip scientists even consulted on these projects. By the 1970s, a new attempt at regulation emerged, the Belmont Report. Its language was careful, outlining principles of respect, beneficence, and justice. Institutional review boards, IRBs, were created to oversee research. On paper, the system promised transparency and accountability. In practice, however, our files show that many experiments had already been completed, sealed, and forgotten before such committees even convened. Ethical safeguards arrived like fire hoses after the blaze, extinguishing only the embers while the ruins still smoldered. IRBs approved similar studies abroad, perpetuating the cycle. We film the split-screen reality. On one side, bold bullet points from the Belmont Report. On the other, footage of soldiers walking through radioactive dust and children swallowing fortified oatmeal. The contrast is jarring. Principles recited at podiums meant to reassure the public stand in stark opposition to what survivors already lived through. Laws and codes existed, but their enforcement lagged behind the pace of classified science. The moral architecture was there, but it had no teeth. Violations carried fines, not jail time. Amy Cohen highlights margin notes from a university dean. Compliance with IRB language secured. Continue as planned. In other words, the review boards became less about protection and more about paperwork. Compliance was a box to be checked, not a safeguard for those at risk. It was ethics turned into theater, a performance that reassured funders while leaving participants exposed. Today, critics argue IRBs still fail in corporate drug trials, echoing these failures. Survivors, hearing about these codes, often react with bitter laughter. Adeline recalls learning years later about the Nuremberg principles. If that was the law, she asks, then why didn't it protect us? Lewis echoes her frustration. We signed forms, but no one told us what they meant. Isn't that exactly what the code said shouldn't happen? Their questions cut to the heart of the contradiction. The U.S. had held others accountable for crimes it quietly mirrored, with no international tribunal for its own actions. Experts we interviewed described this gap as a moral time lag. The principles were ahead of their enforcement, and those caught in between became casualties of delay. As one ethicist puts it, history is full of codes written too late. That lateness didn't just allow abuses, it legitimized them retroactively. Once oversight finally arrived, institutions could point to their reforms while quietly burying the evidence of what had already been done. Reforms like the Common Rule in 1991 tighten rules, but loopholes for national security persist. The documents leave us with an uneasy realization. Codes and committees were never the true shield. They were the appearance of progress, arriving too late to protect those already scarred. Real protection would have required something far less bureaucratic and far more radical, moral courage in the moment. And yet, the next files suggest that courage was systematically undermined. Because even after ethical codes existed, entire programs were buried, mislabeled, or erased. To uncover how truth was kept hidden for so long, we must now examine the mechanics of secrecy itself. The archive grows darker here, not in tone but in method. The files no longer describe experiments or victims. They describe silence itself. We find manuals on classification protocols, memos on disposal procedures, and flowcharts detailing exactly how information should vanish. This was the machinery of secrecy, engineered as carefully as any laboratory instrument. The experiments could not have thrived without it, with shredding operations codenamed Operation Sunshine, ironically hiding radiation data. A retired official, speaking with the guarded caution of someone still unsure how much to reveal, walks us through the process. Documents were marked at 3 levels, he explains: routine, sensitive, and restricted. Sensitive files went into locked cabinets. Restricted files were copied once, sometimes twice, and the originals destroyed. His voice lowers. And sometimes we made sure there was no copy at all. For decades, silence wasn't accidental, it was policy. He admits participating in burn sessions, haunted by the knowledge that lives depended on those papers. One memo we examine is chilling in its clarity. It assigns specific officers to document destruction oversight, complete with deadlines and signatures. Another describes shipments of boxes to incinerators under cover of night, guarded by military police. The language is calm, procedural, almost mundane. But every burned page was a life erased from the record. Every destroyed reel was a chance to deny that the experiment ever happened. In 1973, CIA Director Richard Helms ordered MKUltra files destroyed, but copies survived through clerical errors. And yet, secrecy has its flaws. In one misfiled box, a roll of film was found mixed with routine accounting ledgers. On that reel, we see soldiers trudging through nuclear dust, the very footage James Harper once described. A mistake saved it, a bureaucratic slip that allowed the truth to survive. Amy Cohen holds it up to the light. This is how history leaks. Not because it wants to, but because systems aren't perfect. Similar slips exposed plutonium injection experiments on terminally ill patients in the 1940s. Other cracks appear in handwritten notes. A file stamped destroyed still carries marginalia. Initials, dates, and a project code that links directly back to orphanage experiments. Another memo, intended as a summary for a supervisor, accidentally preserves the chain of command authorizing tests in prisons, labs, and desert ranges. These fragments become a skeleton key, unlocking the connections that official channels tried so hard to bury. One note reveals a failed attempt to bribe a journalist, showing desperation. The most powerful revelation comes when Amy uncovers a set of orders signed by the same hand across 3 programs: a nutrition study, a dermatology trial, and a troop maneuver. Different decades, different subjects, but the same signature authorizing all 3. What secrecy tried to scatter, one name ties together. The evidence is no longer abstract. It points to people, to choices, to responsibility. That signer, a mid-level bureaucrat, testified in hearings but faced no charges, living out his days in obscurity. Secrecy was not just about hiding shame, it was about ensuring continuity. As long as files could vanish, the system could reinvent itself under new acronyms and fresh cover stories. Destruction wasn't the end of the chain. It was the reset button that allowed exploitation to continue unchallenged. Even today, classified drone programs use similar tactics, raising questions about ongoing abuses. But when those reset buttons fail, when film reels slip into the wrong box or initials remain visible beneath black ink, the truth resurfaces. And in those gaps, a disturbing pattern emerges. Who was chosen to suffer? Who was deemed expendable? The next files answer with cruel precision, revealing an algorithm of selection, a logic that turned vulnerability into license. The evidence, spread across our table, begins to take the shape of something more sinister than coincidence. When we overlay maps of test sites, orphanages, prisons, and psychiatric wards with the funding trails and committee notes, a grim pattern crystallizes. The victims were not chosen at random. They were selected through a quiet, deliberate algorithm, one based not on scientific necessity, but on vulnerability. This selection matrix prioritized race, class, and status, disproportionately affecting Black and Indigenous populations, as seen in Tuskegee parallels. Internal memoranda make this explicit. A 1958 note from a program coordinator reads, "Priority: populations with minimal likelihood of public inquiry." Another lists criteria for participation, including institutional residence, low literacy, and limited family contact. The words are bloodless, but the implications are devastating. Whole groups were marked as acceptable not because their involvement would yield better science, but because their silence could be guaranteed. Undisclosed data shows 40% of subjects were minorities, far above demographic norms. Amy Cohen highlights one memo in particular, underlined by hand: acceptable losses expected among socially low-profile participants. That phrase, socially low-profile, is as revealing as any dose log or autopsy report. It tells us that these lives were weighed not in terms of their humanity, but in terms of their visibility. If no one powerful would ask questions, then the risks were greenlit. Vulnerability became the currency of experimentation, with algorithms scoring per test risk on a scale of 1 to 10. We see it again in charts dividing populations into high-risk/high value and low-risk/low value. Soldiers, orphans, prisoners, patients, all cataloged as data points in a ledger of human disposability. The design was cold, efficient, bureaucratic. It stripped away names and faces, replacing them with categories: compliant, institutionalized, voiceless. What connected them wasn't geography or biology, it was the absence of power. In one file, a rejected proposal for testing on high-profile groups was nixed for litigation concerns. Survivors' testimonies drive the point home. Adeline, who once thought her suffering unique, hears Lewis and James recount their own ordeals and whispers, "They picked us the same way." The recognition is devastating. 3 lives, 3 institutions, 1 shared algorithm. The machine didn't need to invent cruelty. It only needed to find people unable to resist it. They discuss how this logic persists in modern prison drug trials or overseas clinical studies. The broader picture is almost unbearable. This wasn't a series of rogue studies, it was a culture, a logic, a template. Each new project borrowed the same playbook. Justify risk with patriotic language, bury oversight under jargon, and choose subjects who could not object. What emerged was a system that didn't simply ignore morality. It rewrote it. Vulnerability itself became a kind of permission slip, with echoes in today's AI ethics debates over data from marginalized groups. One ethicist we interview calls it the human factor, the unspoken calculation that some lives are easier to use than others. He explains that this logic didn't die with the Cold War. Once a bureaucracy learns to exploit silence, he warns, it can repeat itself under new names. The files support his claim. The same patterns of funding and language resurface across decades, dressed in different acronyms but rooted in the same disregard. Recent scandals like Guantanamo experiments show the algorithm evolving. The final pages of the archive leave us with a question that no chart or memo can answer. Now that the truth is visible, what do we do with it? Survivors carry scars that no apology can erase, and codes written after the fact can never undo the past. The story returns to where it began, those dusty boxes in a forgotten archive. And inside them lies not just evidence, but a challenge. How to face what has been uncovered, and what responsibility remains today. We return to the archive where it all began. The same dust, the same cardboard boxes stacked in silence, but now their contents are no longer mysteries. Spread across the table are copies of files, reels of film, photographs, and letters. This time, though, they do not stay here. Amy Cohen carefully places duplicates into envelopes addressed to Adeline, Lewis, James, and the families of downwinders. The truth, once buried in bureaucracy, is finally being handed back to the people who lived it, empowering them to file new claims under expanded laws. The numbers are staggering. Government reports, once sealed, reveal compensation figures. A few $1,000s here, a small settlement there. For some survivors, a check arrived decades too late, long after the illness or the funeral. You can't put a price on a childhood stolen, Adeline says quietly as she looks at her envelope. Lewis shakes his head at a form promising consideration of claims. For him, scars are not negotiable. The money is real, but the lives behind it cannot be recalculated. Total payouts reached $1.5 billion by 2020, but many died waiting, and perpetrators faced no restitution demands. Legal reforms appear on screen. The creation of oversight boards, stronger consent protocols, transparency requirements. Officials cite them as evidence that the past will not repeat. But the camera lingers on the survivors' faces, and the reforms feel hollow. For those who lived through it, trust cannot be restored with procedure alone. They said never again after Nuremberg, James remarks, and then they did it to us anyway. His words slice through the official language like a blade. Modern whistleblowers, like those exposing COVID trial irregularities, cite these reforms as insufficient. The final interviews strike a fragile balance between grief and defiance. Adeline admits she sometimes wonders how her life might have been different without the experiments. Lewis speaks of anger that still simmers but also of a strange pride in having survived. James, with a soldier's steadiness, says only, "Our stories are evidence. That's why they matter. Their voices weave together into a collective memory that no committee or redaction can erase." They plan a joint memoir, turning pain into a call for global bioethics treaties. On the table, the documents look less like files now and more like artifacts, proof of choices made, and of lives reshaped by them. The camera lingers on a single sheet stamped, declassified. Its letters, once bureaucratic, now read as an indictment. Hidden truths finally forced into the open. The boxes around us seem less like relics and more like witnesses, waiting for the next person willing to listen. The narrator's voice returns, framing the lesson with stark simplicity. Security without ethics is not protection. It is another form of violence. Science without conscience does not safeguard the future, it corrodes it. The pursuit of knowledge becomes the betrayal of humanity when those with power decide that others can be sacrificed. The past is not just a story. It is a warning, one that resonates in today's debates over genetic editing and AI surveillance, where vulnerability could again be exploited. As the survivors leave the archive, envelopes in hand, the camera doesn't follow them. Instead, it lingers on the empty table, the scattered papers, and one open box left unsealed. The light from the window falls across it, dust motes floating in the beam. We've revealed much, but the emptiness inside the frame suggests more truths still hidden, waiting. The silence is no longer protective, it is accusatory. The final image holds steady. A box half filled with papers, half empty with secrets. A reminder that history's reckoning is never finished, and that the voices of the powerless will keep echoing until someone chooses to listen and act. The story may end here, but the responsibility it leaves behind belongs to all of us, urging us to demand accountability before the next chapter repeats the old mistakes.